Jumping Jack by Kaz. I've been hearing this story ever since I was a child. They say that around 1920 there was a man who farmed a successful apple orchard. His name was Jack. He had a wife, 2 sons, and a daughter. No one knows the name of his wife and 2 sons, but his daughter was Mary Beth. The man loved his family, but however, Mary Beth was his favorite. Although times were different for women back then, he was planning on naming his daughter the heir to his orchard, and he was training her in the craft of apple farming. In the fall of 1920, apple season was in full swing. Coincidentally, on October 31st, Jack was out with Mary Beth collecting apples in the afternoon. One of their largest trees was directly adjacent to a small river, and the day before there was a heavy thunderstorm. The storm caused the water to be unusually high, and the current to be stronger. While Mary Beth was trying to pick an apple from this large tree, she fell backward into the river. She was never taught how to swim. Her father jumped in after her, and for a few minutes they were both fully under the water. Thankfully, Mary Beth climbed out of the river a few yards downstream. She got caught by a large branch or root and used it to pull herself out of the water. Her father, however, was not seen for several hours. Later that night, the police searched for Jack, and they found him. He had drowned in that river hours before. He turned up a few miles downstream, covered in cuts from sharp river rocks and with foliage from the river's surface wrapped around his body. They said he got stuck on a rock submerged underwater, and by the time the current freed him, he was already dead. The family mourned, and eventually, as Mary Beth became an adult, she took over the orchard. The orchard was in business for many decades, and Mary Beth was a bit of a local celebrity for her apples. Those closest to her would always say that whenever the fall came around, she would begin to act differently around those times. Towards the end of October, she would spend a considerable amount of time beside the large tree where her father jumped in to save her. She would sit near the tree and seemingly talk to herself for hours. The years continued to go by, and eventually Mary Beth passed away. She was never married and had no children, so the orchard just closed down and eventually turned into a public park in the early 2000s. The park is of course called Mary Beth Orchard Park, and it's still there to this day. When the property first became a park is where the real story begins. On Halloween in 2005, there was a group of 4 kids from the same neighborhood in the park after dark. There are residential areas where people live on either side of the park. They were trying to get home by crossing from one side of the park to the other. It was a much faster way home to cut through the park rather than going all the way around. The kids were counting their candy as they went through the park, having fun and casually going to the direction of their neighborhood. Suddenly to their left they heard a sound. It sounded like a large branch breaking and then falling into the nearby river. The 4 kids got curious and went to investigate the sound. It was dark, so they cautiously walked up to the location where they heard the noise with their flashlights in hand. They got to the area where they heard the sound and scanned the river with their flashlights. They didn't see anything. The kids started to turn around to go back to where they were going, but as they were all turned away, they heard another sound. It sounded as if a branch broke. There was a brief silence that was interrupted by an even louder splash. Frightened, the kids quickly turned around. Again, they didn't see anything. There weren't even any ripples in the water from the direction it sounded like the branch fell. They made their way back home a bit more hastily than before. They all got to their respective houses and went straight to bed. The next morning, the community was in for a shock. The sets of parents for each of the 4 kids were found in the river. They had drowned. They were covered in cuts from the sharp river rocks, and foliage from the river's surface wrapped around their bodies. The police launched an investigation around town regarding the murder of the kids' parents. They were trying to find the person or a group of people that could have done this. There was only one lead they had. There was a little girl who was also coming home from trick-or-treating that night. She was also a resident of the neighborhood where the aforementioned kids lived. As she was walking down the street headed to her house, she saw someone trying to climb a fence of one of the houses to her right. The house belonged to one of the now deceased sets of parents. She did not have much time to react as the person turned around to look at her as they struggled to climb over the fence. At least, she thought it was a person. There appeared to be a man in front of her. He was dimly lit by a nearby light from one of the other houses. He He was wearing what appeared to be torn, wet clothes with grayish skin on his face and arms. From what she could see of him, he was covered in scars or bruises. Seeing someone in this condition, especially that late at night, was very frightening. His apparent condition was not the scariest feature about him. The girl swore the man had no eyes. It was not as if he had lost them, but as if he had never had eyes at all. It was just skin where eyes should be. To this day, the man that was seen that night is the only possible lead. Unfortunately, the police, even 17 years later, have not been able to identify him. In those 17 years, people have reported seeing this mysterious man again. Strangely, they have only seen him at night at the end of October. There has never been another incident like what happened in 2005. This is likely because no one else has ever gone back in that park after dark since that night, and especially not on Halloween either. Due to the strangeness and tragedy of that night, the testimony of the little girl, and the history around the area, many people believe that the man responsible is not a man at all. Many believe it is the spirit of Jack. Because he jumped into the river to save his daughter, townspeople refer to him as Jumping Jack. He has no eyes because he failed to find his daughter before he drowned, and his body is in the same condition it was when they found him 100 years ago. They say he is angered by the fact that his resting place is now disturbed by town residents. Perhaps he is also disturbed as Mary Beth is no longer there to talk to his spirit by the river, as she did when she was alive. I believe he enacted his revenge back in 2005 by taking the parents of those 4 kids. The children went to the place he drowned on Halloween, and in his rage he gave them the same fate that his daughter had to live through.